What a fucking intro. The fucking motorcade? Yeah, the low angle really is not very flattering. Okay. Like Kornilov and Alexiev, Anton Ionovich Dinkin had risen from humble birth and poverty to a position of high command in the Imperial Russian Army. The son of a Polish Catholic seamstress and a Russian serf soldier who had fought in 3 wars before he retired with the rank of major in 1869, Denikin had entered the army at the age of 17 and the General Staff Academy at 22. A childhood spent in a shabby 2-room apartment in the Polish industrial town of Wrocław had given him the tenacity to succeed where men of lesser will had failed. Just 45 when he took command of the volunteer army, Denikin devoted all of his stubbornness, resourcefulness, and energy to building upon the foundations led by Kornilov and the dying Alexiev. He needed time and resources. In the late spring and summer of 1918, rapid and unforeseen shifts in the courses of events in Russia's southwest briefly gave him both. While Denikin and his senior commanders struggled to keep the volunteer army alive, their enemies faced other problems. Grinding its teeth, as its representative, said Lenin's government, had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Imperial Germany on March 3, 1918, just 9 days before after Kornilov had begun his icy march. 300 years of triumphs won by Russian arms and diplomacy dissolved in a single moment. 60 million people and 2 million square kilometers of territory, including land that had produced nearly a third of Imperial Russia's crops, slipped from the Bolsheviks' grasp at Brest-Litovsk. When they moved their capital to Moscow in mid-March, their domains included only a seventh of the former Russian Empire's sugar beet fields, a quarter of its coal mines, iron foundries, and steel mills, and less than 3/5 of its population. Russians must measure to the very bottom that abyss of defeat, dismemberment, enslavement, and humiliation, Lenin announced bitterly. They must, he said, understanding that an epoch of most grievous defeats was upon them. On the eve of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Germany's jackbooted armies had marched into the Ukraine, the vast repository of natural wealth that had made up the southwest of the Russian Empire, in order to secure its coal, iron, and foodstuffs for their war effort. Advancing along rail lines, they received an enthusiastic welcome from anti-Bolshevik railroad workers and restored the Ukrainian national government that the Bolsheviks had driven into exile a scant 3 weeks before. Soon afterward, they replaced the ineffectual Ukrainian national government with a more efficiently pro-German regime headed by General Pavlo Sadorovsky, a former aide-de-camp to Nicholas and one of the wealthiest men in the Ukraine. Sokorpatsky had no secret of his monarchist sympathies, met with Germany's Kaiser in Berlin, and, to the outrage of Ukrainian patriots, proclaimed his gratitude for the powerful backing of the Central Powers, to whom the Ukraine owed its salvation. At the same time, the Germans continued their march east, almost unopposed by Antonov's inexperienced Red Guards. They entered Kharkov, Odessa, and on May 6, Tangarog, at the request of the anti-Bolshevik Ukrainian government that they had just installed. Clearly, the Germans in May 1918 were in better position to deliver military support to the Whites than any of Russia's wartime allies, although few among the Whites were so naive as to think they would do so for any reason other than their pressing short-term need to bring Russia's natural resources into the struggle on Europe's Western Front. On their side, white generals desperately needed weapons, and white politicians could not help but hope that the Germans would bring to South Russia the order and stability that they seemed to have established so easily on the Western Ukraine. Could military aid from Russia's former enemies now be used against the Bolsheviks? That was the question that the whites struggled to answer in the spring of 1918. The law of natural preservation, Cadet leader Mikolov insisted, as he struggled to set aside 4 years of anti-German speeches, must take precedence over any moral contentments made earlier in times to former allies against the Bolshevik menace. Mikolov urged that the volunteer army accept an alliance with the Germans to bring about the resurrection of a true Russian government. Like too many politicians, Mikolov used semantic shadings to widen the gray area that separated right from wrong. Yet for men of a more straightforward views, among the Don Cossacks, the prospect of German aid against the Bolsheviks also covered enticing prospects. Now led by Peter Krasnov, the Cossack general who had brought the Bolsheviks to the Pokolov Heights a few years after the October Revolution, a special Cossack assembly for the salvation of the Don, abolished all laws that had not been issued in Russia since the abdication of Nicholas. Not at all troubled by the issues of principle and allegiance that Mikolov tried so desperately to explain away, Krasnov hurried to exchange Cossack grain for German weapons at the rate of 1 rifle and 30 cartridges for 36 pounds of grain. Within 3 weeks, the Germans delivered machine guns, artillery, shells, and more than 11,000 rifles and 11 million cartridges to Krasnov. Although Krasnov and the Cossacks had no objectives to exchanging Russian grain for German guns, Denikin and Alexeyev remained stubbornly opposed to making agreements with the Germans. Alliance with the Germans, Alexeyev announced grimly, is more intolerable and politically inexpedient. And in a union with Germany, he warned, Russians would be condemned to live as political slaves and economic paupers. Insisting upon no relations whatsoever with either Germans or Bolsheviks, Alexeyev announced that the task of the Volunteers Army will be to continue unchanged. There must be a powerful, disciplined, and patriotic army to wage an unrelenting fight against Bolshevism in order to establish a unified and legal government. Convinced that the leaders of the volunteer army must remain loyal to Russia's wartime allies, neither Denikin nor Alexeyev would accept Mikolov's view that treason and desertion must take on new meanings in the struggle against the Bolsheviks. Nor would they repeat Krasnov's assurances that the Germans would observe complete neutrality in the conflict that still raged in Europe. Denikin, Alexeyev, and Krasnov could not agree about an alliance with the Germans, and they remained sharply at odds about the future of monarchy and democracy, should Russia be liberated. Although convinced that, in the normal course of events, Russia ought to come to a restoration of monarchy, Alexeyev feared what an open declaration of support for any political principle would split the volunteer army. Wisely, Denikin supported him. What we have, a small handful of men, to decide the fate of a nation unknown to the Russian people and without their knowledge, he asked. The army ought not to meddle in politics, he concluded. As far as I am concerned personally, I shall not fight for any form of government. Yet, Krasnov could not set his monarchist sympathies to rest so readily. Although he later claimed to have counseled the Cossacks not to meddle in the affairs of the Russian state and leave it free to set up whatever form of government it preferred, he already had convinced his followers to repudiate the socialism of the October Revolution and the democracy of its February predecessor. Greatly outnumbered by their Bolshevik foes, the whites desperately needed to settle their differences and unite their fragmented forces. On May 28, 1918, Krasnov and the high command of the volunteer army met for that purpose in the village of Manikiza. Yet, their differences proved too broad, their personalities too much in conflict, and their aspirations too diverse. Krasnov and the Cossacks thought mainly of a war to liberate Cossack territory from the Bolsheviks, while Denikin and Alexeyev called for a national struggle to create a great unified and indivisible Russia. For that reason, Krasnov would subordinate his Cossacks to Denikin. Oh, Krasnov never would subordinate his Cossacks to Denikin, nor would he allow them to fight outside the territory of the Don. Most of all, he disdained the double standard that allowed Denikin to disdain all contact with the Germans, but accept German weapons and ammunition, so long as they first passed through Cossack hands. The volunteer army is pure and without sin, Krasnov remarked bitterly some weeks later, for it is I, the Don Cossack, Ataman, whose filthy hands take the German shells and bullets, wash them in the fires of the quiet Don, and once cleaned, pass them on to the volunteer army. To their credit, Krasnov's Cossacks continued to supply Denikin's forces with German weapons and munitions, provide limited funds that had come into their hands from the banks of South Russia, and allow wounded soldiers to recuperate in Cossack hospitals in exchange for Denikin's promise to defend the Don against Bolshevik attacks from the Kuban. Yet, they could come no closer than to creating a common force against the Bolsheviks, for Krasnov resented Denikin's condescending view of him as an upstart commander.
That is unfortunate. I wonder how long it's been like that. I'm in charge of the future and I can't figure out where people stand.
When Denikin launched his second campaign into the Kuban on June 22nd, Krasnov marched north and east. Toward the bastion in the lower Volga, to which the Bolsheviks had retreated after the Germans had driven them from Rostov at the beginning of May. As one of the most important railroad centers in Russia, it had become the home of new armaments and petroleum industries during the First World War. With these to support them, and spared from facing the full weight of the White armies by the failure of Denikin and Krasnov to unite their forces, the Bolsheviks built Tesarin into a fortress to anchor their defenses in the southwest that summer. Krasnov and Denikin did not command the only anti-Bolshevik forces in Russia during the spring of 1918, nor were theirs even the most significant. On May 25th, 3 days before the disappointing meeting between Krasnov and Denikin, the Czech Legion, a corps of 35,000 Czechs and Slovaks, challenged Soviet authority along more than 4,000 miles of the Trans-Siberian Railway and launched one of the most startling campaigns of the entire Civil War. The force that history remembers as the Czech Legion began in the fall of 1914 as a brigade of less than 1,000 men recruited by the Tsarist government from among Czechs and Slovaks who had settled in Russia some years before. Originally formed to undertake reconnaissance and propaganda assignments behind the Austrian lines, this unit quickly became a focus for the political ambitions of those Czech nationalists who had fled to Paris from Austrian Bohemia at the war's outbreak. Encouraged by Thomas Masaryk and Edward Beneš, the Czech nationalist leaders hoped to use its exploits as an allied force to bolster their efforts to wrest an independent Czechoslovakia from the Habsburg Empire, should the Allies triumph at the war's end. This Czech brigade fought bravely in the 3rd, 7th, 8th, and 11th Russian armies in Austrian territory. Instinctively fearful of all dissident national movements, Tsarist authorities refused the leaders of the Czech brigade permission to recruit replacements along the hundreds of thousands of Czech and Slovak prisoners taken in Russia's victories against the Austrians earlier. Only after Russia's new provisional government opened its prisoner of war camps to Czech recruiting officers in the spring of 1917 did new volunteers swell the brigade's ranks to the size of an army corps before the collapse of Russia's war effort left its future in doubt. Briefly, the enlarging Czech Corps floundered in Russia's revolutionary tempest, until it was proclaimed in part of the Czech armed forces in France and called for its troops to be transported eastward across Siberia, the Pacific, North America, and the Atlantic to the battlefields of Western Europe. On the surface, Masaryk's was a preposterous scheme that required not only Allied help, but extensive cooperation from the Bolsheviks, who had to face the intense pressure from the Germans and Austrians to return the Czechs for punishment after they had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Fearful that even the slightest Bolshevik betrayal could bring them before the Austro-German firing squads, the Czech Legion's commanders viewed the safe passage agreement that Masaryk negotiated with Lenin's government at the end of March 1918 with alarm, because it required them to surrender most of their weapons. Hesitantly and with much suspicion and great caution, they began their journey. Then on May 25th, they intercepted a telegram sent by Trotsky to Soviets in the towns and cities along the Trans-Siberian Railway, ordering every Czech who was found carrying a weapon anywhere along the route of the railway is to be shot on the spot. Certain that they had been betrayed, the Czechs attacked the small red forces that held the Trans-Siberian stations and made ready to fight their way to the Pacific port of Vladivostok. The Czechs' victories against the disorganized Siberian Reds during the early summer of 1918 underscored the weakness of the Bolsheviks and showed that the comparatively small but well-trained and well-led armed force could be very potent in the chaotic conditions that prevailed in Russia. Within 48 hours, the Czechs seized the central Siberian cities of Novonivlesk and Chelyabinsk and arrested the Soviet commander for food supply, who had come to Siberia to speed shipments of grain to Petrograd and Moscow. Before the end of the month, they captured the Siberian provincial capital, Tomsk, and added Omsk, the largest city in western Siberia, with an armory that held 1,000 rifles and many machine guns, and Samara, key to the Middle Volga region, to their victories before the middle of June. That Siberia was honeycombed with anti-Bolshevik organizations made their task all the easier. During the months after the October Revolution, hundreds of socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks had made an unlikely alliance with thousands of Tsarist army officers who fled to Siberia, where the Bolsheviks' weak authority continued to be diluted by the region's vastness. The estimated active anti-Bolsheviks in western Siberia alone approached 7,000 in mid-May, and these proved only too willing to join the Czechs. In Novonikolsk, one eyewitness remarked their battle with the local Reds was over in 40 minutes. In June 1918, the Czech Legion found the Allies no better prepared for its first victories than the Bolsheviks, for no one in France, Britain, or the United States had expected its eastward march to revive the prospect for reopening a second front against the Germans. Indeed, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty had made the Allies fearful that the Germans would force millions of Russians into industrial and military service to help their war effort in the Western Front. Germany is not hampered, like the Western powers, by any standards of Christianity, one British statesman insisted as he warned that his country's enemy would show no hesitation, using starvation and flogging, backed by machine guns, to bring Russians in the lands occupied by the German army into the trenches of the Central Powers. Indeed, the author of one British government report in mid-May 1918 even had forecast a return to the German Empire of conditions of the ancient Roman Empire, with legionnaires fighting on their frontiers and slaves working at home, both recruited from subject races. Then, Lord Robert Cecil, Britain's Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, had told Parliament the great foundation of stone of Britain's policy must be to see Russia remain a great and powerful non-Germanic nation. Hello, Bastian. It's okay. Life happens online.
You having fun?
I am, dude.
That's good.
I can feel it. Yeah, it's starting to build up. Dude, look, man, I had a friend, she wanted to join the club, and she asked somebody in the club, and it was like, she asked like 3 times, and now she's not interested. I just want to make it clear, dude. My mission is to make it fucking available for everyone. We can't just fucking close the doors to people. this point in the club, everyone should be able to fucking join, as long as they're a Fresno State student.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need the club to grow.
What's the club? Club?
Fashion Inc., bro.
Oh.
But I have something going on too.
Okay, that's all about.
Yeah, I have something going on too, dude. It's tight as fuck. I have no advisor, so I can do anything I want. Like I'm a club without a professor, because every single club on campus has a professor advisor, and they suck because they don't want to do anything. They just want to like play it safe, as safe as possible. They don't want to spend any money. They don't want to do anything. And so like I'm allowed to set up events and really just do whatever the fuck I want, man.
That's cool.
Yeah, the cops used to fuck with me, but now they don't, because now I got papers. I got papers, man. On the 25th, I'm gonna be at the speaker stand all fucking day. All fucking day.
Are you excited for that Friday?
Yeah, hell yeah.
No, it's good tonight.
I still got a fucking, I lost my needle, so I gotta go find another one. Yeah.
I gotta get the water.
Later, homie. Yeah. In mid-May, Lord Cecil had urged his nation's allies to consider using Czech Legion to reopen a second front against the Germans, rather than transport them to the battlefield of France. Angrily, the French had rejected his proposal and continued to insist, as they had since the Great War's outbreak, that all resources must be concentrated against the Germans in the West. This is not the hour. Oh, this is not the hour. France's premier, Clement Sue, had wrote indignantly. For you to think that depriving our subjects was so courageous, well trained and profoundly devoted to our cause. At the very moment when its final rupture with the Bolsheviks was in the making, Britain and France thus agreed to keep in force the initial plan to transport the Czech Legion around the world to fight on the Western Front. The Czechs' unexpected victories all along the route of the Trans-Siberian Railway finally convinced the French that Allied intervention in Siberia could be of great value in their war against the Germans. In Allied headquarters all around the globe, anticipation of large-scale action hung heavily in the air, especially since Britain, China, and Japan already had landed token forces on Russian soil, beginning with the Chinese Guards, who had driven the Russians from the Chinese Eastern Railway in December 1917. Early 1918 had seen the British dispatch small intervention forces from other parts of Russia at almost monthly intervals. At the end of January, General Dunsterville led the beginnings of Dunsterville from Baghdad toward Baku. Then the Royal Marines landed at Murmansk at the beginning of March. And finally, 50 more Marines marched to Vladivostok in conjunction with a larger Japanese contingent in early April. Although he had been unyielding in his insistence that the Czech Legion join the Allied forces in the Western Front, even Francis Clemenceau had spoken of some form of Allied intervention in Siberia after receiving exaggerated reports of French citizens being killed in the Kursk at the beginning of January. Only the United States continued to stand resolutely against the military intervention. Although America's Secretary of State Robert Lansing insisted that the hope of a stable Russian government lies for the present in a military dictatorship, backed by loyal, disciplined troops. President Wilson continued to resist nuclear troops against the Bolsheviks. Kaledin and Don Cossacks remain convinced would restore stable government in Russia. With President Wilson still refusing to support military intervention against the Bolsheviks at the beginning of 1918, his allies had placed their troops and their hopes for an anti-Bolshevik force in Siberia in the person of the corrupt and rapacious Siberian Cossack Ataman Grigory Semenov, who at 27 looked every inch the bandit he was. Colonel John Ward, commander of the forces the British eventually sent to Siberia, remembered most of all Semenov's eyes, that bludgeoning, rather to an animal than a man. He wrote about the man later, the whole pose of him, he added, is at first suspicious, alert, determined, like a tiger, ready to spring, to rend and tear. Instinctively, Semenov understood that any man who commanded an armored train and a few hundred men had the strength of an army in the far-flung spaces of Siberia, and he used his armored trains in much the same fashion as a naval commander might use destroyers or battleships to subjugate enemy ports. In all but the most desperate circumstances, legitimate governments shunned alliances with the men of Semenov's type. During the first months of 1918, the French, British, and Japanese thought they had no other choice. The Czech Legion's first successes allowed the Allies to shape their policy around a more legitimate and reliable army force than Semenov's. And even the United States began to think of exploiting the Legion's unexpected victories. It would be a serious mistake to remove the Czechoslovak troops from Siberia. America's minister to Peking wrote to Secretary of State Lansing in mid-June, "If they are not in Siberia, it would be worthwhile to bring them here." The most dramatic policy reversal, however, came from France. In scarcely more than 2 months, Clemenceau turned from demanding that all detachments of the Czech troops should be transported with the swiftest means to the Western Front, to urging, "All our efforts must be now directed to averting the action of the Czechs to the complete occupation of the Siberian Railway in order to prepare quick progress for Japanese intervention." Fuck. Clemenceau had good reasons to center his hopes for reopening a second front upon the forces of Japan. Of all the allies with armed forces in the Far East, the Japanese stood most ready, able, and willing to render military and logistical support to the Czech Legion. Their efforts to achieve their national objectives in Siberia's eastern wartime provinces influenced the course of events more directly in 1918 than the actions of any other great power. Ever since the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, Japan had pursued an aggressive policy on the Asian mainland that had brought her into direct confrontation with Russia and had produced important shifts in her alliances with the great powers of the West as the 20th century moved toward the end of its first decade. Perhaps most important, Japan's expansion into Manchuria and Korea put her increasingly at loggerheads with American statesmen who had plans to expand their nation's commercial and political interests in the Far East, including efforts to acquire a measure of control over the railways of China and Siberia. The Americans had looked especially to the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 to strengthen their position in Asia, for they expected that monument to modern engineering to place their country at the very center of the world's shipping lanes. A scant fortnight before the canal opened, the outbreak of the First World War offered opportunities for the Japanese to expand onto the Asian mainland that even their most aggressive statesmen had not thought possible. While the storm that burst upon Europe drew the attention of the other great powers away from Asia, and with some of the most influential elements of Japanese public opinion insisting that such an opportunity will not occur again for hundreds of years, Japan moved quickly to occupy German territories in the Far East, strengthen her foothold on the mainland, and weaken the position of her American rival. The Russian Revolution broadened the prospects for Japan to expand even further as her diplomats and military planners focused their attention among the railways that connected European Russia, Manchuria, and the Far East. Yet any movement by the Japanese into northern Manchuria and eastern Siberia threatened to bring them into conflict with those American financiers and politicians who continued to be fascinated by the prospect of linking their nation's great northern railway to the Trans-Siberian by means of shipping lanes that stretched from Seattle to Vladivostok. Like the Japanese, these men hoped to profit from Russia's domestic turmoil. And, again like the Japanese, they identified their schemes with their nation's interests and pressed their government to support them. In the spring of 1917, the United States, therefore, sent a Railway Advisory Commission to Vladivostok and Petrograd for the publicly announced purpose of helping the provisional government restore its collapsing rail system. Headed by John Frank Stevens, former chief engineer of the Panama Canal, and supported by the Railway Service Corps, which the United States had later sent. Okay, that's a big sentence. As they moved quickly from the advising Kerensky's government to managing Asiatic Russia's railways, their presence strengthened their nation's sphere of influence in eastern Siberia at the expense of the Japanese.